For more than 2,000 years, standards of living stagnated, caught between slight improvements in technology and the forces of Malthusian population increases. All this changed about 250 years ago. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, standards of living have soared. And if you show a graph, data 2,000 years ago are not that great, but basically they show a consistent pattern of basically nothing changing. And then suddenly, around 200 years ago, in some places in Europe and then successfully other places around the world, you see almost a J curve. It just shoots up. Today, the typical person lives better in many respects than royalty did hundreds of years ago. This has led economists to ask, to what do we attribute these remarkable increases in standards of living? What caused this dramatic change? There are three explanations that have been put forward. The first is capital accumulation, that people save, and by saving enough, productivity increases. The second is improvements in allocative efficiency, getting better in managing resources. And the third is learning to do things better, to get more outputs from a given amount of inputs. The evidence is overwhelming that the latter is responsible for the overwhelming bulk of the increases in standard of living that I described earlier. In short, the transformation to what might be called learning societies that occurred around 1800 for Western economies and more recently for those in Asia appears to have had a far, far greater impact on human well-being than improvements in allocative efficiency or resource accumulation. The fact that technological change, innovation is at the core of these increases in standard of living was recognized by one of the great economists of the first part of the last century, Joseph Schumpeter. But interestingly, his work, while widely discussed, has never been part of the mainstream in economics. Those of you who took standard economics course, they might have had a paragraph about him, but he has not been part. This emphasis on the importance of learning was really shunted aside. This is actually quite remarkable because just about 60 years ago, my own teacher, Robert Solow, who got a Nobel Prize for his work in this area, actually attempted to quantify what fraction of the increases in standard of living, he was only looking over the last 80 years, but still that was a long time, what fraction of the increases in standard of living were due to capital accumulation on the one hand, and what fraction was due to learning broadly understood. And basically his conclusion was that something like 70–80% was due to learning. Well, the next question is, what caused this dramatic change from thousands of years of stagnation, from a society without learning to one that did? And as we look around, what were the critical historical events that were going on around the time at which this sudden change in the pace of learning occurred, I think the single event that stands out is the Scottish Enlightenment. And I think it's something that here in Scotland you ought to recognize how important that was, not only for Scotland, but for the entire world. And actually Edinburgh played a very important role in the Scottish Enlightenment. Of various places in the city you have statues to some of your great heroes, including people like Hume and Adam Smith. But these are really people who played an important role in transforming the entire world. And and transforming, I should say, for the better, because there are often people who transform things for the worse. So the question then is, what were the ingredients, what were the aspects of the Scottish Enlightenment which plays such a vital role? And obviously in this short talk, I can't really do justice to that. But obviously one important aspect of this was recognizing that change was possible. If you read the history of medieval, Middle Ages, people were, the idea of progress was a foreign idea. It was not an idea who had yet been invented. It's an idea that we take for granted, but it was an idea that was really invented in the Scottish Enlightenment and became universally accepted. Another important aspect of this was, that I'll come back to a little later on, is questioning authority. Although there was some debate about which authorities to question. In earlier periods, some authorities were viewed not to be questioned, and other authorities, it could be questioned. But the third important ingredient was the scientific method. A scientific method that provided a systematic way of figuring out how to improve productivity. Obviously, once one engages in this kind of historical analysis, there are further questions that one wants to ask. What caused the Scottish Enlightenment? That's obviously a deep historical question that would be a subject of its own lecture. But I think one thing is clear, and I'm going to come back to that later, and that's education. There are some remarkable things about Scotland in this period that many of you may not know. Even at that early stage, Scotland had been committed to the idea of, I won't say universal education, but widespread education. So even 250 years ago, the male literacy rate in Scotland was 75%. This is really remarkable, because we are, striving in the developing countries to get numbers anywhere close to this. And to show you the difference between Scotland and your neighbor to the south, at that time, the male literacy rate was 50% higher than in England. But it's not just the broad-scale minimum level of literacy that made a difference. Equally, and perhaps even more important, was access to to tertiary education, to university education. As you know, that's a issue that is being widely debated, and Scotland and England have been going in absolutely the opposite direction. Scotland has been trying to make sure that there is universal access to education, no matter how poor you are, your parents are, and with free tuition. England, for reasons I do not understand, well, I could give you a political economy analysis, but has been going in the opposite direction, saying that education, university education, should be something for the elite. They've been striving to increase inequality and have succeeded very remarkably in achieving an increase in inequality. Within the OECD, England, the UK as a whole, used to be in the middle of the pack. And as they have followed the American model, they have now achieved second rank in the advanced world. They haven't yet achieved the level of inequality that America has, but they are striving for it assiduously, and with the current ambitions of the Cameron government, they have every hope of a success. Well, this debate, which is a really important aspect of a society's philosophy, is a debate that goes back 250 years ago. 250 years ago, the cost of university education in Scotland was 1/10 of that at Oxford and Cambridge. So you can see that there are long historical antecedents to this debate. This is important. It's not just a question of numbers of tuition, because it changes the nature of society. And it was this widespread access to education, and including access to university education. It wasn't a world of equal opportunity, but it was a world of more opportunity than south of the border. And I believe that kind of widespread education of the citizenry played an absolutely central role in the development of the Scottish Enlightenment. Well, if it is the case, as I believe very strongly, that it is learning that has given rise to the remarkable increases in standards of living over the last 250 years, there are strong implications. One implication is that one should focus one's analysis on the impact of policies on learning, on how do we enhance the ability, how do we create a learning society. That should really be the focus of analysis. In the case of developing countries, the focus should be on the diffusion of knowledge from developed to developing countries, recognizing that what separates developing from developed countries is as much a gap in knowledge as a gap in resources. This perspective on the nature of development was one that I tried to bring to the World Bank when I served as chief economist there. But even in developed countries, there are enormous gaps between best and average practices. The technology used by the most productive firms and the average, that gap is huge, and obviously the gap between the best and the worst is even larger. For those of you who studied economics, this has really important implications because the standard economics analysis begins with the concept of a production function. It begins with the assumption that everybody has shared knowledge about how to produce things. And the issue of how do you disseminate knowledge from the best practice to the average to the least efficient firm is not a question that's even asked. It's just assumed that knowledge disseminates. But it's obviously the case that it doesn't. And this is just one example of the many aspects of what goes into creating a learning society. Creating a learning society is both about how do we move the frontier of our knowledge forward, but also how do we learn from each other? How do we make sure that the level of productivity of every citizen, every firm in society is the best that it can be? So, in short, successful and sustained growth requires creating a learning society. And of course, this is especially true in the 21st century as we move to a knowledge economy. There are many aspects of creating a learning society. We learn through research, research such as that goes on in the universities. But we also learn a great deal in the process of production. And that's an aspect, we call it learning by doing, that's often been ignored. And as I'll comment in a few minutes, has profound implications. If you don't produce steel, you're not going to learn how to produce steel. Nobody learns about producing steel by reading a textbook. The knowledge about the production of steel only resides in the steel mill. And you get better about producing steel, again, not by reading textbooks, but by producing. Now, of course, you have to have knowledge as you engage in the production process, as you have to have knowledge as you think about as you see what goes on in a steel mill, about how to make that steel mill more efficient. But if you've never seen a steel mill and you're only reading a textbook, you'll never be able to make many advances in the production of steel. Not only do we learn by doing, of course, we have to learn how to learn. And that's another topic to which I'll come in a short while. So the creation of a learning society is affected by our institutions, not just the obvious ones like the patent system and the education system. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk is illustrate that with several examples. Before going into detail by looking at these examples, I want to discuss two general principles. The first is that markets on their own will not do a good job in creating a learning society. This is a fundamental proposition because it means that laissez-faire market economies will not succeed. They will not be the most efficient. There needs to be systematic interventions by government. Adam Smith would have recognized this, an example of what has come to be called market failures, where markets do not necessarily produce efficient outcomes. But unfortunately, Adam Smith's latter-day followers, people who think of themselves as disciples of Adam Smith and have not read seriously his works, often do not recognize this. Let me reiterate. There is no theory that says that markets where innovations, where learning is important, are efficient, either in the rate or direction of innovation, of learning. Quite the contrary, the presumption is that they are not. And one of the main chapters in my book, Creating a Learning Society, tries to show this. What I'll try to do this evening is to try to explain some of the reasons why this is so. There are several underlying problems. The first, and perhaps the easiest to understand, is that markets where innovation is important tend, for good reasons, to have limited competition. If we think about some of the most dynamic, innovative sectors of our economy, like the internet, we have faced a succession of monopolies. We had a monopoly in the operating system for PCs. And that monopoly did everything it could to squelch competition, quite successfully, and was convicted of engaging in anti-competitive practices in Asia, America, and in Europe. It was told to stop those practices, but it first said, go away to the government. Eventually, the government was effective in stopping some of those practices, but the built-in distortions persisted even to this day, even after the worst of those practices were stopped. In case any of you don't know who I'm talking about, we're talking about Microsoft. But if you look at industry after industry, unless there's strong government intervention, you wind up with strong concentrations of market power. We see this in the area of search engines today. We could go through field after field, and it's evident. And it's almost always been the case. The second is that innovation is risky. And these are risks that cannot be insured, again, for good reasons. Reasons that are explained by the theory of asymmetric information to which you referred earlier. You can't go to an insurance company and say, I want to buy insurance against the risk that my research is going to be a failure. The insurance company would know that you would know better about whether your research was going to be successful. And besides, it would know that if it insured you, you would have no incentive to succeed. So in practice, these are very big risks, but they are risks that are uninsurable by their very nature. But that means that firms which are naturally going to be risk averse will underinvest in these really, especially in the really big innovations. The innovations like the development of the internet, innovations like the transistor and the laser. And these are innovations which have always been supported by government, one way or another. Thirdly, and that's very much related, innovation requires investments. Sometimes these investments are very large. Capital markets are imperfect, that is to say, often hard to get capital, again, especially for research, because unlike a building, real estate, where you have a collateral. When you lend money for research and things don't work out, what are you going to seize? A bad idea? There's nothing to serve as collateral. And so you have financial markets. You know, Bernanke talked about a savings glut. Too much savings in the world, believe it or not. The problem wasn't a savings glut. The problem was, you know, we had huge needs for investment in research of how to develop new technologies to deal with global warming, huge investments of needs for investments in other areas. But our financial sector wanted collateralized investment. It liked the idea of investing with collateral, building shoddy homes in the middle of the Nevada desert, but not investing in research. I'm exaggerating because there are small niches in the financial market that actually do support innovation. One of the big innovations in America is the venture capital industry, but it's a small fraction of our financial sector. Fourthly, there are important spillovers, what economists refer to as externalities, where others benefit. Knowledge is, moreover, what economists call a public good. This is a technical term. A public good, in the way economists use the term, is something where other people can benefit without taking away from you. That is, in contrast to a